and pooled after the fact, that we wouldn't always have everyone have the time or shared skill set to read together, but that would be useful to just plop down in the bottom.
Okay, we're recording. Sorry for no intro. We can like pause and restart it if you want to like pretend like we know what we're doing, and then I can like do that. Start, and I'll delete the earlier one, or we'll leave this.
No, I'm a fan of looking like, you know, we did what we did, and it's okay not to look entirely like we know what we're doing. That's totally fine. And also, in any case, Don, since it's my first time facilitating, I'll be asking lots of questions anyways. So it sounds like I should kick things off by saying we have a recording now. We all joined a few minutes ago, and then we didn't quite have the recording started. And I said, hi, everybody, I'm Michelle. I'm moderating this week, and it's my first time facilitating moderating, so I'll be asking lots of questions of you folks who've been here lots of times. All good. And I asked Don that what is the first thing we usually do, and it sounds like usually the moderator goes around and calls people out in the order they see them, and people can introduce themselves. So on my screen, it looks like Rico is first. Rico, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Rico Gardafe. And I work with Brendan at Query. And I've been a part of Data Together kind of on the edges in support of Brendan since I joined our company exactly a year ago.
So good to meet you. Hi, Rico. Let's see. Next, I've got Kevin.
Hey, everyone. I'm Kevin. I'm from San Diego, and I'm from Edgy, and I've been contributing all over the place with Edgy. On steering committee, web monitoring, and now community coordinator.
Hey, Kevin. Let's see. We've got Brendan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brendan. I work with Rico at Query, and we're part of Data Together. And I think we know most of you, but yeah, looking forward to a lovely discussion.
Thanks, Brendan. Next on my screen, I've got Matt.
I'm Matt Zumwalt. I work at Protocol Labs with Michelle, and I coordinate all the stuff around IPFS and libp2p and IPLD, and I also was one of the people who started Data Together.
Thank you, Matt. Next, I've got Rob.
I'm Rob. I float around writing a lot of code and tools for some of the web monitoring related projects at Edgy. And I also have been doing some work helping IPFS folks at Protocol Labs do better documentation, although that engagement is coming to an end soon.
Thanks, Rob. Let's see. Next on my screen, I apologize, maybe you pronounce Jay? Oh, I can't hear you.
So, can you hear me now?
Yes.
So many thumbs up. I'm Jevi. I'm new to the team. Just joined last week. Hopefully I get to see you guys next week at the general meeting. Should be fun. I'm very, very excited to join Data Together.
So glad to meet you, Jevi. Let's see. Next I've got Dawn, and Dawn has someone else on her screen as well. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Dawn, based here in Toronto. I have been involved in Edgy and Data Together for a while, and I helped kind of, I think, kickstart the process for this reading group, and I've been so excited for every session. And I'll hand it off to Jack, who's also involved in the planning of it.
So, my name's Jack. I'm a student here with Dawn, and also very interested in decentralization, so looking forward to this conversation.
So good to meet you both, or have you both. I've met one, not the other. Let's see. Next on my screen is a Edgy account without a name.
Oh, yeah. Is that me?
I think so. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Aparna. I've just joined Edgy, I guess, last week, and so I'm just really excited to follow this conversation and see what's going on.
Hello, hello, welcome. Let's see. Next, I see Song Young. Oh, no, it's on mute, I think.
Yeah, your audio's not working. It was working before when I logged in.
Is it working now?
Yep.
Great. Hi guys, I'm Song. I'm a postgrad philosophy student in New Zealand, University of Canterbury. I'm interested in studying the internet through the lens of analogies between the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of the internet.
Spectacular. Song, good to meet you. And Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. I work with Sung in a somewhat informal way at the moment because our nonprofit is still in the formation stages, so you know how that goes. We do have an office now, which is lovely. The nonprofit being Metamer Labs, and the primary project of it at the moment being the Meme Studies Research Project. So basically thematic web archive and post-web archival even. Yeah.
Wonderful. Is there anyone else that I missed or anyone that called in on a line or something that I can't see? Okay, I think we caught everybody. Let's see. Again, I'm going to pause for a second to say, Don, or anyone else who's been here a lot, I figure I'll just jump into the readings from the week, but is there anything else that I missed that you usually do? Okay, I think we're good. Well, everyone, I was very excited for this week talking about the Commons. It's been a very long time, but in school I studied with a little bit with Elinor Ostrom at Indiana University back in the day. So reading these was like, oh, the things that I used to know. So I'm sure I will have forgotten many things and all that, but I'm excited to chat with you all about what we read this week and what you thought about it. So I dropped a link into the chat. Let me know if anybody can't see that. Raise your hand if it's not there. It's our link to our HackPad that we use every week to take notes. Looks like I think we're okay there. I dropped some themes in, but of course they're not the only things that we could necessarily talk about. Also want to say, so the readings were covering Ostrom's Governing the Commons, which is her classic writing. We've got Linebaugh, I think is the person's last name, which is Enclosures from the Bottom Up. And we had Primavera de Filippi's work on how the internet could be viewed as a commons and what that means for potentially, if you look at it that way, what does that look like? Let's see. So I would, of course, like to talk about some of the, let's see. Note taker. Thank you, Matt, for reminding me. I guess you usually ask for volunteers, yeah? And see if anybody can do that, or does the moderator usually also take notes? Okay, Don? Thank you, okay. Don, thank you for volunteering to take notes. And for those of you new like me, it looks like the notes happen in that doc as well. So everything will be in the one HackPad at the end of the day. Let's see. I wonder if the first thing, since we had a lot of readings this week, if one of the first things is to summarize a little bit what the readings, we'll start with one of the readings about the Ostrom and summarize a bit about what it was. Would that be helpful for folks? Yeah, probably. Let's see if I can even do that. Well, if anybody wants to offer what they felt, just to say like 2 sentences on overall what you thought of that particular reading, feel free. I'm going to come look at your faces again and go away from my notes. Anyone? Yeah, no problem, no problem. I have this problem, it's called short-term memory, so I'm going to look at my notes and come back. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, so that Ostrom reading, in my opinion, what I can remember from reading all these good things, was one of the famous first first book, you want to call it that Ostrom comes out and says with her team, like, oh, these ways that we've been looking at public resource economics, common pool resources, maybe it was not true. In the past, let me go grab my other notebook. In the past, she was saying that looking at, yeah, go ahead.
So she critiques the standing assumption that the commons is a disaster, is inherently a disaster, and she pulls apart by basically showing that a lot of the reasoning around the commons is based on some variant of game theory that's basically simplistic, of assuming that people, it rules out the possibility of coordinating in order to find compromises that work and then governing themselves. And so she critiques that. She critiques game theory and particularly the prisoner's dilemma, but then she also critiques the jump to the assumption that you need a state actor in order to have governance of a common. And then she shows some counterexamples and sort of teases open the topic. That's what she does in chapter 1. It says 1 and or 2. I reread chapter 1.
Thank you very much, Matt, for saving me.
And something I want to inject in there is something I want to make sure we talk about is when we talk about particularly data and knowledge, is that actually a common? Because all of these, like Ostram's really, really specific of defining that a commons is about a natural resource that is often self-renewing, that is depletable, that it's something that if everyone uses it, it goes away, right? And if it's used too much, it goes away. And that's not actually how knowledge functions. And so knowledge, and it's also not how data functions. And so I want to explore into that as well. Whereas it does connect with the other reading, like Primavera's work around Wi-Fi network or community Wi-Fi networks, where that is a resource that is finite, that can be depleted if it's overused. So I'd definitely touch on that parallel because it's a important one.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good setup for something that I was thinking about also, and that none of these readings touched on the way that economists separate different types of goods, which actually, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but if you, in a lot of these sorts of readings, will often show a graph or a little 4-box little thing, which I could probably draw in 2 seconds, where they're putting goods that are excludable along an axis of that box and goods that are rivalrous along a different axis of that box. So speaking of what you just mentioned, Matt, I know that knowledge often falls in a separate box from the kind of the common goods corner of that because of the rivalry spectrum. And that was the bit that I think I dropped a theme in there that was does it matter that our readings mostly are talking about, they are entirely talking about the excludability factor, like private versus common. There's another way you could kind of turn that and say, oh, what about things that get used up or not, rivalrous or not? And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe knowledge, that we can treat that the same way. But I was also thinking about these things. Let's see. I see thinking thoughts. Anyone?
Yeah, actually, when I started reading it, the first thing that came to mind was back in the, I think it's still kind of prevalent now, but not as much, is when you use the peer-to-peer for downloading stuff. So one thing that they commonly use in private, those private communities that you have to register to get in, so you can download illegally. I know nothing of these things, by the way, just saying. I've never downloaded illegally at all. But it reminded me, so in those systems, what they do, you do have someone on top being, okay, in order to get your own resource that you have, whatever you want, you must have a 1-to-1 ratio or 0.8 ratio of share and give. So when I was reading through it, I was like, oh yeah, you could totally do that. Then the Ostram just slashes. It's nope, not gonna work, because in these systems, and I was doing a comparison in those peer-to-peer, it's very easy to say, have to have someone governing saying those are the resources that you're using, this is how you're using it, etc. Whereas the argument that she was making, I found very interesting. It's very hard to determine when you say you want to privatize something, it's hard. It doesn't actually solve the problem. Okay, well, who's going to do it? Yes, VC++. It doesn't say, who's going to do it, how you're going to obtain the information, what's the motivation behind actually doing it. And I really liked the game 5 that worked in, what's the name of the place? Alania? Yeah, I really like that it works there where they had everyone come up with their own rules, and then the motivation was, well, if you don't, like, you have to like monitor your peers. Like I really that struck me. I was like, oh wow, yeah, that's a good way of thinking of it. Kind of. Okay, Rob.
Brendan.
Actually, yeah, and I completely agree with Jevi saying that like Game 5 really, I love that Ostrom took the time to articulate what she was trying to say through game theory and try to like push it back through that lens, because it sort of established a degree of parody that I thought really helped to sort of break some of the framing of this like prisoner's dilemma style from the first reading, where there's this notion that we're trapped in this thing. And the thing that I really thought that she pointed out that was really interesting to me was this like notion that the people that are more directly participating in this common pool resource have local knowledge, right? Like they understand things that wasn't, that from a state level or from some abstract perspective, form a degree of obscurity in some level, because it's just too hard to get your head around the complexity of that local knowledge. And for me, when we're thinking about like distributed context stuff, like I really wonder if that's sort of an entry point for thinking for us. Like we often sort of write software with the perspective of like, oh, it'll be a peer-to-peer network, and we don't really stop to think about how, well, we do sometimes. Like there are some great projects that are like Solid from Tim Berners-Lee's project really sort of emphasizes this like local knowledge concept. But it's an interesting like point of entry where Game 5 from that reading really sort of talked about how partners can enter into contracts with each other, and we don't really program a lot of like facilities for that style of exchange, and we don't really sort of tap that sort of advantage as much, and it'd be interesting to see some language emerge around that. I haven't seen a ton personally.
I think Dawn, you wanted to talk next? Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this is jumping 2 things back, so apologies for not addressing the points that you raised, Brendan and Jevi. But so I think that Ostrom edited a collection which was Information Knowledge as Commons. So I think there's a really great article. I think it's the intro of that book, which we actually might want to look at as a way of thinking about trying to relate it, because I mean this book is like largely a collection of empirical work of functioning or failing commons that are natural. Yeah, you got it there. Woo! So I mean, yeah, there's a way that maybe the how this was written and when this was written feels more distant than it necessarily needs to be from kind of the topic we're most interested in. And I would actually go back to this notion about whether or not commons or the how it's being discussed relates to like maybe a traditional description or classification of economic goods. I think that Ostrom is very like careful and canny in how common pool resources are defined, such that, and I can paste it in from my notes. So I actually found it quite frustrating because I felt like it kind of rested on top of like the actual things that were being described, but could transfer to more immaterial goods in a way that doesn't immediately become clear. And so the part that I was thinking of is common pool resource is a natural or man-made resource system sufficiently large enough to make it costly but not impossible to exclude potential beneficiaries from obtaining the benefits of its use. Like that is such a vague like definition of a thing that actually doesn't like that sort of addresses exclusion, doesn't exactly speak about like exhaustion and stuff like that. Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to unpack that, and it would perhaps be helpful to consider another reading to get us closer to there. And I'll just paste that below.
I think Matt?
I don't want to drag us like way into a rabbit hole. Like I've read that Governing Knowledge as a Commons follow-up paper from 2012 or whenever, like I was so excited when I found it, and I was really disappointed by the content because it doesn't really address the fact that is knowledge more like a forest or is it more like a highway? Right? Is it, and in a way it's sort of both. It's a thing that is made by people. that quality is a factor. How it is made, how it is maintained, is a factor of like the ongoing evolution of knowledge of that resource being valuable. And whereas the metaphors that she has built most of her governance stuff around is around these sort of governing of self replenishing resources that can be overused, right? So renewable resources that can be overused. And so I would love it if we dug further, not necessarily on this call, but in future calls, dug further into this mismatch. And is there a mismatch there? Is there like, it feels like there's like language missing. And that book that she edited didn't really address it. It was like a lot of papers about journal articles and peer review, and it didn't really get into knowledge itself as a thing that needs to be governed.
Rob?
Not to continue to dive too much farther into that thing, but I feel like, I don't remember, I think it was in the beginning of the second chapter, which I didn't finish reading, but I feel like she sort of addressed actually that conceptualization reasonably directly, and that she used the bridge as an example, which I think fits with the highway, in that there are ways to think of it in the same context of like a common pool, but a depletable resource, which is like the carrying capacity of the road. And you can overutilize it. And that is detrimental to the road and detrimental to others' usage of the road. So I think she provides at least some avenues for thinking harder about how you conceptualize those things, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, she provides really great hints that are starting points that I would love to run with, but not on this call. We could do a whole separate follow-up reading on this.
We still have time. I also wanted to pause and say we had someone else join. Michelle, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, sorry I was a little bit late. Michelle Browse, I'm on the Protocol Labs team here at BlueCon.
Team Michelle. We have a lot of Michelles at Protocol Labs.
We have 3.
You've met 2 of them now. There you go. Beautiful. Let's see. Well, we do have time. We could spend a bit more time, Matt, chatting on this, and then loop back to the conversation that Brendan kicked off a little bit earlier.
Well, maybe if we were going to do that, let's use that time to frame the follow-up, because I think it's like there's further reading we should do. Like we should pick maybe the opening chapter. Dawn's right that Ostrom's her chapter in that book speaks more to this, and that it's more like a lot of the other essays in that follow-up book sort of go off in a direction that you almost would want that to be rewritten now. But maybe framing what is the question that we're wanting to explore is, Jeremy raised his hand, so I should let Jeremy talk.
Maybe I should learn a thing. Is there something like an official hand raise thing in Zoom? Oh, I'm looking for it. Sorry about that, Jeremy. Thank you, Don.
No, it's all.
Go ahead.
It's all good. There's this. It's a little. I've always found it a bit odd, the hand raising mechanism, but it does make sense. No, I didn't want to interrupt or anything. I just wanted to, when you were talking about knowledge, I wanted to add that there's a lot of very wonky discussion that seems to somehow talk itself into the same rhetorical modes and ways of thinking again and again about knowledge management, essentially, where there's not necessarily a clear epistemic or technical or logistical separation between controlling how others should think and enabling shared lexicons and linking of data. And a lot of the literature that's about it just conflates them and there's a lot of, I think, like moral equivocation going on about a lot of things that I find unproductive in the sense that it's unimplementable in the sense of if you try to manage someone's knowledge who doesn't want to be managed in that way, well, they can go elsewhere. And so that seems like a point that's worth mentioning, is that when people talk about tragedies of the commons, they seem to a lot of the time have a confusion of intentions that is not super clarified, I think, for themselves in terms of what are they trying to make a moral argument? Are they trying to make an information access argument? Are they trying to make a knowledge building argument? They often just kind of get collapsed down into one general sense of that it needs to be controlled. And if you know anything about the history of the internet, you know that almost all of the things that were nice and legible, if they were very top down, they just didn't work, or they just weren't embraced. Like the OSI model is still very useful to use for people as a reference, a conceptual reference, but that no one adopted it. So you have things like that. I think that's worth bringing up. The meta context of a lot of this literature it seems mired in its own uncertainties about what it's doing.
Yeah, related to that, Jeremy, that's also a bit of the reason I was interested in the, like, oh, does rivalness actually matter? It's like if you take Ostrom's later recommendations on what to do in the case of how to manage common pool resources accurately. I dropped, I think, the short 8 points into the notes. It wasn't in our reading, but she's got these 8, like, these are the things you should do to manage common pool resources. It's like, does that effectively matter? Or can you use those points in, say, knowledge, if knowledge even isn't rivalrous? Like, can you take the same blueprint and do the very, like, on the ground thing that Ostrom recommends, which is like, okay, that's great, you have all these theories, but here are some recommendations on how to manage the thing, and you have to look at the problem you have at hand, and this is how you move forward. It's like, maybe those recommendations are still applicable, and it's fine, just move forward with that. Jeremy, I saw you go off mute, so maybe you have a follow-up there. I can't find the raise hand thing, so I'll just ask.
No, I'm all good.
Got it. Okay, great. And I saw, Matt, you dropped a follow-up topic in there for, is that for today or later?
Yeah, that's my redirect
Nope,
of like do a follow-up one.
Got
like
it.
to continue this discussion, maybe this is a workable framing of like this parallel. Because I think in that chapter too, she talks about bridges and she talks about aqueducts. And like there's that question of investment up front into something that will last for longer. And like like maintenance, basically the role of maintenance in a system that's been created by people. And so maybe we could frame that, and we could touch on some of the stuff from her other book, Governing Knowledge as a Commons.
Thank you. Looks like Don, you added that to the notes, so thank you very much. Let's see, any other thoughts on this line of discussion? Checking all the places. Okay, maybe then we loop back to the conversation we cut off a little bit from Jevi and Brian earlier, or Brendan, sorry. You'll have to remind where we left it though, and see if anyone else wants to have a conversation there. Let's see, Don, I see you raised your hand right away, so maybe you're right there.
Maybe, but maybe not in a good way. Or like, this is my attempt to recapture that thread. And I think kind of pulling on what Jevi did of like trying to bring it to a contemporary example that's like feels like closer to this context. That might be a point at some point to transition into the Traeger and Filippi article, which I think is a case of trying to kind of work from Ostrom's sort of analysis of commons and like then apply it in a technological case. And like, I'm really curious if people thought that worked or if it didn't, if it seemed like it was an easy fit or not. Because I think there's like this interesting move where, you know, Ostrom did, or maybe Michelle, you can fill us in, did a lot of her own empirical work, but in many cases was reading other people's accounts of these commons to kind of compile them together to produce this analysis about the 8 principles. And I think what we're seeing now more recently is people then trying to take those principles and like apply them to sites. in practice to both build things or to understand what's going on there. And like, is it helpful? Does it work? In this case, for data together and thinking about decentralization, like what does it offer? That feels like a really big question. And so I think kind of Jevi was sort of hinting at that by talking about like, okay, thinking about peer-to-peer and like your seeding ratio when you're torrenting, or who torrents, I don't know, only legal torrents, only Linux, distro, ISOs, that's all I take.
Absolutely. Thank you for the summary. And I'm always, that's such a skill to be able to summarize things succinctly. So I appreciate all of you who are able to do that on this call. Yeah, does that, Brendan then and Jevi, does that reflect what you were chatting about earlier? And you have any other thoughts on there?
I have some, but I want to leave room for Jevi if you have anything to add. No, okay. Yeah, I think it's in terms of applying. It's interesting how much that they're reading about, like sort of bringing it back into the practical side. To me, and sort of what I was trying to draw at a little bit of this like notion of I think the like Cedar-Leacher ratio is an example of that contract being drawn up, right? It's an example of, hey, if you're going to be on this network, if you're going to be a peer, you can't just be all take. You have to be a little bit of take and a little bit of give, which is actually, speaking to sort of Ostrom's framing a little more, kind of guaranteeing that you're not going to overfish the available bandwidth of a given sort of limited knowledge thing, which, you know, as we know, can propagate more and more as more people, sort of encouraging people to behave in the way that we need them to behave for the system to sort of work more holistically. And I think it's interesting that we have this, Ostrom sort of speaks a little bit to this notion of referees, or like sort of third-party enforcement. We have code, we have software that can in many ways do that. One of the more interesting things about just programming in distributed context is you can't assume that everybody's running the same code as you. So now you have to ask this question of, does everyone have the same referee? That's a bit in the weeds, but I find it really, to me, I find it really interesting that like to me, it seemed to give language to a lot of this. I can't speak as much to the second article, but yeah, I felt like it gives a lot of food for thought. The one thing I would add here is this tweet from E.O. Wilson has been rattling through my brain as we think through a lot of this. I just want to put this out here for thought. E.O. Wilson is apparently somebody who's very into sociobiology, so I don't know if that is anyway helpful. But he sort of said the real problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And where I don't know how that sits with everybody, but the thing that I find interesting here is like when we talk about, we often work in this sort of seam between technology and social, and to what degree are those things sort of influencing each other? I will totally link to that tweet. Give me a second. But I think it's sometimes I wonder, like, as we, like, one of the things I see the distributed spaces doing a lot is we're sort of recognizing that some of our social values are not being reflected in our technology, and some of our institutions maybe aren't behaving the way that we like. And so as we're sort of doing these concrete applications of technologies or concrete uses of different institutional things, but if our institutional sort of like institutional innovation is somewhat lagging, is that sort of a source of grinding noise? Maybe I'm way too off in the weeds, but I know I'm introducing stuff that wasn't in the ratings, so I don't want to go too far. Well,
I do want to say that I think that Ostrom's whole point was that you have to get in the weeds to figure this out. There's some quote about, you know, the whole problem is the rubber meets the road. So I think that's very accurate. So anyways, I think Rob, you may have raised your hand first, and then I think Matt. And I may have missed other people, but Rob, go, and I'll try and find you. Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, I have sort of two thoughts that spurred for me, but they're in drastically different directions. So I pick one, which is that especially like within our context, a thing I thought that was very interesting that's been noodling through my mind since before I read it, but I appreciated seeing it read in that article, was the particular issues, especially in this context, but probably that exists in general in most common pool resource contexts, is who holds expertise, and the problem of like education within whatever cooperative commons group you're trying to build. In the sense, like in that one about like mesh networks, like who holds all the like expertise about like building the networking stuff and all those different tools. And in what we're talking about with like data commons and things, like who holds the expertise in writing the software and the networking tools to be able to spread that information around in an effective way and to make sure that it's reinforced in an effective way, which also feeds back a little bit to what Brian was saying about sort of refereeing and the importance of that role and how do we do it in a technological context that's distributed, where like computers may be running different versions of different software. And I think also connects interestingly with in the first chapter of the reading, Ostrom spends a reasonable amount of time like pointing out the importance of like being able to pull in, like there's a lot about how like individuals utilizing the common tool can like self-police or police each other, but also there are a lot of situations where it befits them to like utilize some of the like commonly paid in resource. So you all profit a little bit less, but you still profit more in the end by utilizing some of that resource to hire on some of that. In her context there was about refereeing, right? An outside third party to help arbitrate or referee or whatever. And I don't know, like I think that's an interesting set of things to think about here, because definitely that software engineering expertise is not equally shared everywhere. And there's deep questions there about like, how do we effectively like referee what's going on and make sure people are, you know, participating or not participating or aren't free riding too much or whatever. Anyway, I don't know. I just want to like connect up those pieces.
Thank you. Matt, I think you were next in line.
Yeah, I think that Wilson quote brings a nice contrast to how well chosen the full set of reading for this week was. I learned a lot from reading the Lindbaugh one on enclosures. I did not realize that the like modern commons that you can walk across in England are the like result of 800 years of like class warfare and like the way the depth and the richness there, and so that tweet or that quote refers to medieval institutions as being not applicable. It implies that they're not applicable because they're old, where I think that like the stuff about enclosures shows how all of those institutions actually allowed for a more dynamic like diversity of voices in that system, and that began in the medieval era. And also that, so this is where the reading that Dawn slipped in at the last minute, which I didn't get to finish, but I read like 2/3 of it. He explores all these ways, like from an ecosystem perspective, like literally an ecologist perspective, all of the long-term impacts of this, of these well-managed commons being managed in like geographically, regionally specific ways, according to institutions that have their own quirks, which has created habitats and has created like, it's done all sorts of things that have carry-on effects in terms of ecosystem services that couldn't have been centrally planned. And only really bore like the biggest fruits when carried over many generations. And so that's where that quote gets at how like a lot of our modern thinking about these things is simplistic in saying, oh, well, there's not a government governing it. So one of the things that Ostrom calls out is like, there's not a government governing this, so there are no institutions, right? They just assume that if they're informal institutions, they don't exist. And so this reading sort of teases out how like, wait, there's a lot going on here that you might not be acknowledging. I think it was really beautiful. Well chosen, Dawn.
Dawn, hi.
Hi, just to attempt, but probably fail this time, to do a very quick summary of what the reading I put in was, because I apologize, I meant to get to it sooner. It was, I also have the book here still because I did it this morning. It was like 9 pages from one section of a book by a UK naturalist called Richard Mabey. I actually don't know how to pronounce his last name. Mabey, maybe. That really drawn on by Lindbaugh in that chapter, Enclosures on the Commons. And so I think Matt did a much better job of kind of speaking eloquently to like how evocative that is. But the other part that always strikes me about how maybe rights and really from this perspective that's like a naturalist and thinking about creating new like commons in place, so in locations, is like the role of the informal and then increasingly formalized commoning infrastructure and actually like creating legacies of new places that maybe don't reflect their original commoning use, but like the landscape that you see in the UK is a product of being formerly commons and sort of this like rich history of like interleaved human use in space. So I read it and get super excited, but it's really far afield, and I feel like makes me think about like the relationship between man and nature. I will stop now.
Watching, waiting, thoughts. I have a slightly tangential thought, but I'm going to wait. Go ahead.
Sorry.
No. I said a thing.
If I
Yeah,
should I continue from that? I was thinking recently about the politicization and so the partisan politics that arises from when you see a lack of extant green belts and commons style city planning and agricultural and industrial planning that arises in the form of things like partisan divides on whether various new urbanist principles like walkability of cities is something for that's for milquetoast liberals. Walkability, oh, you don't really want to walk, do you? Solutions to problems of a lack of extant commons or a lack of, say, a green belt around a city. Basically trying to claw back whatever you can from that space, because there is no sense that this is a thing that was already legitimated by its existence, predating your existence. That to try to introduce it is somehow it's now a matter of politics rather than a matter of collective gain. I see that all the time where cities that are predominantly, so cities that are basically outside of the what you would think of as places like Boston and San Francisco, very liberal cities in the U.S. A lot of pushback in places like San Antonio to their policies about trying to establish various things that are beneficial to the entire population because it's seen as politicking. And to a certain extent, it is politicking because it was not dealt out of politics so long ago that everyone acknowledges it as a common thing to protect. That was sort of harebrained, but hopefully that made sense.
It was perfect. Thank you. All good. No, I agree. It sounds like that. It's that thing when you read something like that article that says, 800 years ago, the commons were like this in England, and you go, oh my gosh, and your brain explodes because you had no idea that alternative and, true history existed. And today it's all, oh, how could you even think that, no one would ever. Yep. So thank you for that article, Don. Rob.
That just made me think again about, and I think I mentioned this in the email, when I was reading the Linebaugh piece, which had the quote from Maybe that made me think about a 99% Invisible episode from a few months ago about the right to roam in England, which is also like a similarly tied in sort of thing. But that is also interesting, I think, in context of what you were just saying, Jeremy, because that was an interesting incident. And maybe this is like a good one for people to listen to. I haven't listened to it since it originally came out, so I might be misremembering slightly, but like an interesting incident of stuff that was coming from like a really old perception of that set of rights and everything that was tied in with the like medieval commons ideas, but had died out and then was sort of brought back in the 70s through like a really like social movement of working hard to push it back in. to normal cultural mindset, and that had to go through that same sort of like repoliticization, depoliticization process by virtue of that sort of having been lost at that one point in time and then having to be brought back. So maybe it's a good example of a similar sort of process that was gone through successfully.
Any other thoughts? Dawn.
I have a question for everyone, and to just pick up on that last line that Rob mentioned. So like how maybe rethinking public access in the UK came out of like figuring out how to re-policize something that had been depolicized. And I don't know why I'm like so stuck on this, but to go back to the DeFilippi article, I think there was an argument that they were making that actually, I think, Michelle, you also referenced in the sort of themes, and I'm so curious what people think. It sort of seems like this like very, this positioning of like decentralizing versus centralizing and re-decentralizing. And I would really love to hear people's thoughts on like whether they agreed with that framing or like maybe see current decentralization as like an attempt to repolicize something that was depolicized, or if that doesn't work. Because I was a little on, I don't know. I want to hear what you all think because I wasn't sure what I thought.
I'm not sure who raised their hand first. I see Rob and I see Matt, and I'm checking. But so Rob, go ahead. But someone tell me if I missed someone.
I don't know that I have anything super substantial to say, other than every time I read pieces that frame it that way, I always feel deeply skeptical that we're trying to return to something that we actually ever did have. I always read the history framed that way, but every time I try and think about what I have seen during my lifetime of the evolution of it and what I understand about people and how it came to be, I don't feel like it really, like there's this picture always painted about that it was like this wonderfully perfect idea of decentralization that then broke down. And I'm not sure that that's really quite accurate. And I just want to say, every time I read that, I have that immediate reaction where I'm like, I'm not really sure that this is painting it accurately, and it's setting us all up for like a false conceptualization of what we're trying to do. I don't know.
Yeah, I think this like in a simplistic way, I definitely see this arc of from mainframes to personal computers to the cloud with your phones functioning as thin clients, and then a move back towards decentralization. So I see that, I see a cyclic pattern there that intuitively feels right to me, and I feel like checking in like it seems real, not just imagined. But then it also, when other reference reading here is like Tim Wu's the master switch, yeah, which he traces the history of like the development of telephones, well, the development of radio and the development of telephones and the development of television and the development of film, and how the pattern of centralization sort of occurred over and over and over in each of those, and he basically traces the oral history there. And so having read that, when I look at this cycle, it makes me reach more for, there are a lot of different meanings for decentralization, right? There are a lot of different ways in which things could be centralized or decentralized, and there is a strong push towards a bunch of different types of decentralization happening now. And I hear you on saying, I don't think of it as a return to something that we had in the past, like, is it something we never really had? But there was this sense in which percentage of participants on the internet, like percentage of people participating on the web who ran their own web servers when HTTP was like getting traction was very, very high. And so it was more peer-to-peer in nature in that sense, even though the protocol wasn't. And they were all using email, which is peer-to-peer in nature. Well, not peer-to-peer, but it's distributed, it's decentralized in nature. And so the things were more participatory, and there was more running of your own infrastructure and knowing how to run your own infrastructure and having a like literal control over like possessing and exchanging, that has been lost and is now people are attempting to restore it.
Jeremy, you had raised your hand, I think.
Yeah, so I've explained in chat, just so that this doesn't go anywhere sideways, what I construed as the relevant topic for discussion that seems salient lately, which is the EU Parliament's various attempts to respond to all kinds of big tech abuses and things of that nature, and how absolutely fragmented and just chaotically vitriolic and really effective if you're a politician who wants to force through your agenda. The public response has been based around various political totems and based around stances where the opposing factions so labels that cause factions that don't in practice have opposing views of what to do about a certain thing, still opposing each other on principle of not wanting to be subsumed into some new label, or wanting to maintain that no, this is the anarchist view, and this is the libertarian view, and this is the etc. And something that came to mind was the anti-terror takedown proposal about having what would, for even the biggest of big techs, be extremely difficult, but for small sites be basically computationally impossible to do, which would be to be able to take down any content that was considered terror content within an hour of it appearing on a service, which has this ridiculously outsized effect on the long tail of self-hosted and somewhat self-determined communities that like Mastodon and those. And what struck me about it was that the slam the door in the face technique, as opposed to the foot in the door technique of that proposal, it really does work for bureaucrats who have no one's interests really in mind, who are pursuing something that's cynical, because it turns the discussion into arguing about what you think terror content is, and bike shedding about whether it is in fact possible to do it in an hour, or whether you should be grateful that there are sites big enough to, like Facebook, that they could do it in an hour. And that struck me as the type of opportunity that if you are politically militant, you are going to take to really hammer your points on social media and in places that have high visibility. Whereas if you're an independent service provider, someone who's trying to run a network, you may not see that as something that you want to discuss at all. It might be too spiky for you and your affiliated your partners and your community members. And it struck me as very effective in if you read it as a cynical political goal to force something through, in the sense that it's so trivial to divide people on the lines of whether they think of themselves as decentralistas or they think of themselves as various. So it seems like I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, except to say that it really does seem like the most effective groups, even the ones that are fairly radical in their politics, all seem to have some way of trying to remove the totems from the decision-making contexts. Not necessarily the way that the projects are presented, but, and that seems to be important, of removing the political identitarian stance taking in the context of having to do things in the world that are reactive. I'm not really sure that there's a solution to that. It just seems like something that I've noted recently, that hardliners become very effective when they just maintain the same dogmatic hardliner stance in response to each of these new things, ignoring the fact that GDPR is a boon for anyone who's on giant social media websites. That sort of thing. If they just maintain this dogma, they do fairly well, because they say, this is our dogma, deal with it, and then they go and build things. So
Looks like Matt.
Well, I think that's where we now maybe arrive at Primavera's article, which focuses on sort of what it looks like for people to build their own infrastructure, and the different motivations for doing that. One of which is education. So people being able to understand how the internet works by having physically deployed pieces of it themselves, and how that has a social function. That like if you have done it yourself, or people around you have done it themselves and you've watched it being done, it changes the way you think and reason about what the internet is and what can be done with it. And it like maybe hadn't felt so clear to me before reading that article, of like that in and of itself being a really powerful motivation for these community wireless networks. Like there are the other motivations too, but that one seems like in and of itself compelling.
Brendan.
Yeah, totally. And I think that this sort of like by enmeshing yourself in the mesh and sort of bringing people into that. Yes, you like that. Okay, Don's talking on mute. Okay, good. I got one laugh today. Enmeshing yourself in the mesh, sort of drawing people into these things that can, I think in practice, like sort of that drawing in can be sometimes a little bit challenging. I can't remember her name. She is a professor here in New York who has got a bunch of art people playing with people involved in the arts, playing with distributed technologies. And she's done a great job of just like getting people excited, getting people playing with hardware, and sort of bringing that in. And to me, where that sort of starts to intersect interestingly is like Ostrom was pointing out to this, like, be careful in the way that you abstract. If you talk about game theory as a prisoner's dilemma, and you make policy based on that, you're going to get a weird thing. And so like as us trying to sort of draw people into new modalities of thinking, whether they be politicized, depoliticized, or otherwise, I think it's like these kind of discussions for me form a lot of the foundation upon which we can sort of construct carefully considered abstractions and carefully considered entry points to some of these things that sort of like for a long time you can actually just take for granted, right? Like you can just use the internet and it exists and it works. And a lot of what we're doing here is sort of questioning some of those structures and sort of engaging critically with some of these structures and trying to invite others to have, as Rob said, like and to sort of deprioritize expertise a little bit and open up the sort of foundations for more people to be able to enter this conversation, I think is like one of the most important things we can do, but it's also one of the most difficult things to do, given how difficult it is to articulate just why we feel, I sometimes feel like we're like, you can feel it, Neo, the matrix, it's all around you, right? Like, and it's like the internet is centralized and we need to deal with it. Like, and it's sort of, I feel like there's an element there of like, how do you articulate that in a compelling way that brings somebody in without creating an abstraction that that sort of glazes over very important details, to me is like one of the toughest points of consideration.
Song.
Hey, so Brendan had talked about, E.O. Wilson's quote about the Paleolithic minds and medieval norms and godlike technology, and Ostrom's and how Ostrom's game theoretical explication provides parity with more negative Malthusian views, which also rely on game theory. And it made me think about how evolutionary explanations for cooperative tendencies, although they're not satisfactory explanations in and of themselves, also provides a parity with similarly pessimistic views about our human ability to cooperate. And there's an alternative tradition of Darwinian, of altruistic and Darwinian views about humanity in the vein of thinkers like Kropotkin and Bookchin, Um, and Ostrom also goes into evolutionary views of commons and how they evolve and how they act like evolving entities. She specifically makes use of distinctions between what she calls strategies, norms, and rules, in which strategies are kind of like evolutionary strategies in the sense that they're the result of specific needs and demands and pressures, and they're very much pragmatic decisions on the behalf of the participants, like what they do. But rules are things explicated in verbal terms in order to make sure that people are behaving along the lines of the demanded strategy. And the key point that I was trying to get at here is the norms bit, because Ostrom says that if we focus too much on the abstract and the mathematical and the game theoretical aspects, we're going to miss out on the hidden rules at play, which are the norms that people have. And these norms are very much social, but also very private in the sense that they're internal. They're internally motivating, and these are things like personal satisfaction you feel when you help people in the community, which don't show up if you're focused on the external benefits that you gain from playing the game theoretical games. And so, just like Jeremy was saying, on the one hand, it's up to the organizations to be self-aware about their kind of totemic norms that influence the way that their strategic decisions and their rule set structures are created, but also for the analysts and the researchers to acknowledge that the norms play a very strong role in affecting how people behave in the real world. So, yeah.
Yeah, lots of sparkle fingers. So good, exactly. I want to also pause for a moment and give folks a chance if we've kind of talked a lot in that corner of the conversation and the last what we've been going through for the last few seconds. Is there anything anyone, maybe folks who haven't had a chance to speak yet today, had any questions from the reading or questions you want to pose, or different trains of thought that it raised for you that we just haven't had a chance to fit in yet? I want to give space for that. Kevin.
Yeah, this kind of ties back to Matt's question earlier about like whether knowledge is depletable or scarce resource. And I was just thinking, and I haven't studied much of this, so I'm very curious what people think. But like studying like the game theory stuff, it seemed like it was based all on like a scarcity economy. And then we have like these abundance economies as well, right? And so I'm just curious, like, yeah, like how those rules would need to change in an abundance economy, because all the examples she gave were like scarcity economies. And so that's what I'm really curious about, if people have any ideas about that.
Could you restate that question again?
Oh, sorry. I was just if like Ostrom's principles and stuff, because it seemed like she applied them to like scarcity economies, and then Matt, you had brought up earlier like knowledge, because I'm really curious about like knowledge and data, and we see it more as an abundance, like it's not depletable, and so do those same principles apply? Would they apply?
Well, maybe I could add to that. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's not, well, in terms of like the internet, it's not really that the data that will be depletable, but maybe the access to it. I think if you look at it that way. So it like, if you take into consideration what we're trying to do right now, where the access to certain types of data sets, right, that's kind of like what the whole, well, part of what the data together is, where you're trying to make sure that the access to the data sets are still available. I think if you look at it that way, it kind of relates a bit. And I guess you could also look at the whole movement before when they were trying to privatize certain parts of the internet, which it's been quiet lately, and hopefully it just stays quiet and we just forget about it, because it was like a big horror in the US. But when you look at it that way in terms of the use of the internet being scarce, so it's not really the fact that the data in general, but maybe the access to it or the use of it. I don't know if that made sense.
Looks like Jack.
I guess to expand or build on that. So I think I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective from some people, because I don't have much connection with data together really, and most of my interest is with decentralized social media. And in that case, I mean, the resources being managed, of course, there's knowledge. I would say we could also have the parallel concepts of like truth or opinions. But then there's also issues of autonomy and privacy, which I think relate to what Jeffy was saying about access to information. Certainly autonomy is a role of that, but also your ability to distribute information in particular directions. And I mean, I feel like maybe it's weird to talk about privacy as a resource per se, but certainly, well, as one's personal data is treated as a resource, then it impacts upon one's privacy. So it might be that's an area where there is actually a bit of scarcity, perhaps. And so I don't know if that's super productive for this conversation, but that's what was coming to my mind. As I think, speaking of knowledge alone as the resource here, certainly from my perspective, has a few blind spots.
Matt, I saw you said enclosure in the chat. Would you like to tell us more?
Yeah, it's that enclosures from the bottom up reading. Like, despite my concerns about whether how far the metaphor is applicable to knowledge, that reading rang really true. This topic of enclosure and the back and forth of some people attempting to enclose and others resisting it because it's not only about access to the resource and the value there, but also access to the productive capacity, like the access to the ability to let your cows graze there so that your cows can grow fat, right? And both of those. So it's access to the resource that's there so you can produce, and it's access to the product of the commons, are both things that I think completely apply with knowledge. And that the problem of the risk of enclosure and the problems of enclosure completely apply there. But then there's the other question. So with the data rescue is a really great example where a lot of the data sets, the actual data that has been produced was not the thing that was the most at risk. It was the funding for the research to continue. And so that's like this other factor of knowledge. How do you actually fund the production of high quality knowledge, like high quality information and knowledge resources as the world continues to evolve? And I think that doesn't map quite as easily to the commons example. That's where you get more, it's like bridges and aqueducts.
Rob.
I just want to ask, because like I said before, I didn't really finish reading the second chapter, but in the beginning of the second chapter of the Ostrom book, she talks about viewing both like the production side of the commons problem and the resource utilization side of the commons problem. So it feels like that speaks directly to the production side, but did she talk a lot more about that in there? Was there stuff she said that was applicable to that in that way. I'm just asking because I didn't get there.
I'm trying to remember. Can you help me by giving an example on the production side? That did she bring up something specific that was in there? Or Matt, do you remember? I saw you go off mute.
I did.
Maybe you just
I didn't.
remember.
I read the full book like last October, and I only read chapter 1 this week, so I don't remember what was in chapter 2.
Okay.
I know she talked about aqueducts and bridges, and but I don't remember the.
Well,
maybe Don.
She classified actors in the system as sort of like how did she say for people who took the resource, like acquirers or
oh, sorry, I read this.
Don might have this better than me.
Yeah, they're called appropriators. So I think there's 2 parts where it gets talked about, and the notes I have are on page 42. There's a discussion around this notion of like the supplying. So it is kind of like a production problem, but it's actually institution, like it's about institutions. So it's talking about the collective action problem. And then there is a part where they're talking about the sort of different side of how rules are produced, but I don't have strong notes talking about like, except in the definition of common pool resources on page 30, where they sort of discuss like the production side as opposed to the appropriation side. But I can read you the definition of a provider. So those who arrange for the provision of a common pool resource are providers. So that's like the supply, the production side. And anyone who actually constructs, repairs, or takes actions that ensure the long-term sustenance of the resource system itself are producers. And those are like roles, not individuals. So they could be the same people, and you could occupy like these different positions in like relation to a common pool resource. I would say probably not, I don't remember it being more in depth addressed in that chapter.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was mute, and I was not mute and typing away. Sorry about that. I was going to drop a little, I realized for our notes, I should drop a little link to that box thing that I talked about earlier, the 4 different types of goods. It reminded me in this last conversation because I remember when I was looking this up for the themes for today, pulled up, whatever, some quick note on the internet, and it's like knowledge gets often put into the public goods corner. But there's all sorts of discussion as to why that might not be the case. Also, the link that I'll drop in there, it has fresh air in that corner, which also is always up for, is that really a public good that is non-rivalous and you can use it till the end of time and that will never affect anybody else's usage? Probably not true. So it's interesting how these things, you talk about this more and you find that most things actually are not non-rivalous public goods. So that gets back, Kevin, to what you were saying too. It's, how you slice the pie and how things go. It's like, well, most of the time there is some sort of limit there. And, but what is it? Is it knowledge? Is it only, like a few people brought up earlier, only people who have certain sorts of background are able to participate. That's a sort of limit. So many different things. Yeah, I have a related thing on that, but I want to see if anybody else wants to add to this discussion right now. Looks like Don.
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much, but I just wanted to say this about Limebot, and that makes me really excited is like there's kind of, I think, a move that Limebot is doing, which is kind of like a retelling, like drawing on history as a way, or like a recovery of a history that is not usually told around a place, to like allow us to think about more equitable or better current and future models. And so I think that gesture or that move is something that I always now look at every other thing and I'm like, what is that? Like, what could that untold history be about decentralization? Or I don't know, data stewardship or the internet. I mean, I feel like there's so many people doing this work of like telling new stories or less well-known stories about the internet. But I think there's something there that feels like I haven't figured out if the right one has been told yet, to help me think about what it is we're all doing here about data together.
Well, here I'll add something that I think a lot about, and I have no solution for yet, is the challenge that we face because there could be so many different commons or markets involved in what we do. That's not a very elegant way to put it, but what I mean is when we first started this conversation, I know lots of people were, several dropping in the chat things about kind of providing the infrastructure as a commons and how you might manage the infrastructure. On the other, in a maybe more traditional commons, you've got, say, fishermen who are both the people providing the infrastructure and also the ones in control of whether or not that thing is successful. Like you are the ones who are not overfishing, or yes or not. In this case, we've got a separate group of people who don't understand the technology quite as well or something like that, who have kind of a separate commons that they're dealing with. Maybe that's the knowledge commons, and it's a bit of a separate conversation. So it seems to me that when technologists have these discussions, it ends up being more about the infrastructure side of things, and we forget. So say, okay, we believe that decentralization, everybody should be anonymous. Okay, fine. That runs directly against some of Ostrom's ideas about how you build trust in the system and how you manage that system appropriately. So what happens at the other end when somebody puts, I don't know, is bullying your kid or something like that on the decentralized system? There's no, it's like this other sort of commons that we've enabled and not put in place necessary rules to make that a successful kind of life-enhancing place to be, and not just like this negative, like nobody likes to be on the internet sort of thing. So the space between kind of the protocol layer and what you get in the end is so wide in this world that we live in. What do you do about that? And that's something I think a lot about, and I'd like to know what you think about it. Brendan, maybe?
Sure, yeah. I totally, I just to like try and pull a few threads together, it's like a lot of this seems to really surround how do you attempt to pull apart deeply complex and enmeshed things that, and so when we're talking about like untold histories and decisions about privacy, like it's how we frame these things and how we sort of enter them really becomes so crucial to the conversation. And Michelle, I really hear your point about how we sort of, in a technology space, we tend to fall along this axis around protocols and like trying to understand the sort of underlying technical implementation of something, but then we sort of re-enter that through like a storytelling perspective, like trying to understand how we got here or how or why a certain thing exists in a certain way. Depending on who you're talking to, you could completely reframe that. You may be talking about the same thing but you may silently or subtly loop in some other section of a system, right? Like right now, I don't know about you guys, I'm watching this explosion of Mastodon, like in Twitter right now. People are just frustrated with Jack Dorsey and they just want Mastodon, and it's and so it's just like this sort of like knee-jerk reaction where we've got a whole bunch of a story forming now around a technology. And then like for a lot of us who have sort of seen Mastodon for a long time, we're like, but wait a second, that's federated. And like, I have a whole set of opinions around the decentralization model that you're using there. And then there's this whole conversation about like Mastodon is actually just GNU like privacy tools ripped off and rebranded, and there's a whole question there about like ownership and sort of accreditation of this whole thing. And so it's just like, depending on who you're talking to, you can reframe the same nasty sort of nest of concepts in a way that is really, that creates a completely different presentation. And I think that that's one of the toughest things that we're sort of grappling with a lot with Data Together, where we're intentionally holding organizations of people and organizations of technologies, and we're just doing this all the time. And I think that I find that really stimulating, but I also find that it does mean for a lot of like haze. I've gotten very used to it, but I don't know if others are comfortable with so much haze. To me, I think it's the sound of slow but steady sort of like new thoughts congealing.
I think Matt?
That also makes me think of, I think yesterday Meltem Demir's was tweeting about, I think her catchy thing was decentralization as a fallacy or something. But actually she was basically just saying that blockchains aren't decentralized. And that is her entire experience of decentralization, apparently. But in her thread of comments, she got into like the teasing apart that people conflate the objectives with the technology. So decentralization does not equal privacy. Decentralization does not equal social justice, right? Like she sort of rattles off a couple of those, that people sort of bundle all of that stuff together and assume that like this one term points to all those things. And often the politics get bound into your technical implementations, which actually in Primavera's article, she talks about mesh networks versus other forms of community Wi-Fi networks, and that the mesh networks that have been deployed at length were predominantly driven by political aims. Like it was about political sensibilities and philosophy more than like technical pragmatism. And that's where like when all these things are bundled together, which I see you flagging, Brendan and Michelle. But isn't that life?
Yes, exactly. I want to say we've got 4 or 5 minutes left till the end of the hour, so I want to make sure everyone knows that. And I can sit here and think about which bits go in which part of the type of good till the end of time, so I should probably cut myself off before we keep going down that rabbit hole, but it'll be something I'm thinking a lot about over the next years, probably working in this space. But yeah, any other things that the readings raised for folks, or different tangents that we didn't quite get to? We can definitely at least let people leave with those nuggets, even if we don't have time to talk through them here with us today.
I guess the one last thing to close off is, so we spoke a lot using metaphors, but it's always good to remember that policies based on metaphors can be pretty harmful. I guess that's one thing to close off on.
Absolutely. Kevin, I think?
Yeah, I think the thing that I liked the most from the Ostrom reading was that the concrete example of the Alaina fishermen. And then to your point about like talking too much with technologists, I'm like really excited to just go and talk to regular people and try to explain this to them and see what they think of it. And I'm glad to like gain this understanding from this group, and so I can just like try to like talk to my friends and explain the decentralized web and why it should matter to them, and get a sense of like people on the ground, like regular folks, like their opinions. I think they're the ones that are going to have to like make their own rules, self-govern. So we have to remember that's who we need to talk to a lot more.
Well, maybe on those last few notes of, remember, we need to see how this works in the real world, and we need to be talking to folks. Those are good reminders for us to leave on. Although, Don, I saw your hand up. Maybe you've got some, you probably want to announce next week, though. What's coming up next? You should give us a preview. Or not next week, but next month.
Yeah, that was my like horrible attempt at Sparkles, but I can do that preview because we need your help. So the next month, which is actually coming up fairly soon, we're doing one early in September 4th, I believe is the next one, is kind of a return now that we spent some time spent on like ownership and commons, going back to think about decentralization alongside centralization. I think that's been a theme through every session so far. And we had tentatively said we wanted to potentially find one more reading. I proposed one actually from Nathan Schneider, who we read some of the platform cooperativism, one of the chapters was from him as well, which actually is a really good sort of sinking into previous uses of decentralization, and maybe it's a little behind on sort of contemporary, all the ways it's being used. So if people maybe have an idea on an extra reading for that, if you could look at the GitHub repository, there's an issue. That would be much appreciated. And I can just say the Schneider reading that I'm proposing is called The Irresistible Power of Decentralization and Its Elusiveness. Said that so weird. And then after that, we have two that are very hazy. One, privacy, which I think maybe Jack and Jevi and maybe like this kind of goes into this immaterial knowledge commons thing kind of touched on today. So we have two, but need more thoughts on readings, and they aren't really well fleshed out. And then the last one will be on justice. And there, again, as well, we have a couple shorter article readings. I think that could be a great case too to draw on the contemporary projects in like the data justice, digital justice space, because there are a few, and we, I think, are lucky enough to be connected to folks working on them. But yeah, so more thoughts and readings, and if stuff was stirred up from today, we could add it into the future threads below. Like I think we've identified a couple really concrete areas that we could really spend some time with. And so maybe after this arc of readings, we can or of the sessions, we can pull back and review those and sort of see how we want to address them. And so the one that came out today, I think, is this notion of like knowledge commons and sort of the framing that Matt Zed provided. Hopefully that was okay.
It was perfect. Thank you, everybody. We're at the hour. This was lovely. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you again next time.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
See y'all.
Bye.
Can someone remind me where these recordings get posted, or do people already done?